Well, good evening. Hello and welcome. As Verity said, I can't see you, so I'm talking to a silent screen. I do laugh at my own jokes occasionally, so I apologise in advance for that because you may not find them funny at all. I can't see you, so if you want to make a cup of tea, put your feet up, relax, that's absolutely fine. My name's Louise Fenton. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton in the School of Art. I teach across digital and visual communications and most of contextual studies. My research is all focused on witchcraft, Haitian voodoo, New Orleans voodoo, anything that's paranormal, occult, weird, fascinating, strange. That's my area. I'd like to thank Verity and the University Centre in Stafford for hosting this and the support they've given these talks. If any of you would like to contact me, my details are on the screen. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. I've also put my email address. I'm quite happy to answer questions. And thank you for those who are returning visitors to my talks. For any of you that have posted any comments, I've had some lovely comments and suggestions for things I should look at and read. So thank you for those. So this talk tonight, I should have candles around me and some of my weird and wonderful stuff, but it's called Halloween, History, Tradition and Superstition. And I'm sure most of you are aware of Halloween. If you haven't noticed, it's about to happen again. Every shop, along with the Christmas goods I've noticed, have got all their Halloween goodies on the shelves. So what I'm going to look at tonight is, first of all, the history from Celtic origins through Roman times, Christianity, and to contemporary tradition. I'll have a look at Halloween in America. You can't talk about Halloween without mentioning Halloween in America. We'll look at parties and costumes and how they've evolved, trick or treat and how that came to be. And then I'm going to finish with black cats and ghosts, superstitions and spells. I'm not going to cast any spells. I'm not going to show you how to cast spells, but just some of the traditions that are associated with Halloween, historic and contemporary. As Verity said, if any of you have got any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as we go or at the end, and we will get through them. There will be time. I'll be talking for about half an hour now, and then there will be time for Q&A. So, many agree that the roots of Halloween are from Samhain, and this is the Celtic festival which was held on the 31st of October. Now, you might see it pronounced Samhain, Samhain. I've seen it Samhain. For the purposes of this talk, I will be pronouncing it Samhain. And as I said, this took place on the 31st of October. It was the end of summer, so end of October. It was the time when the crops were gathered. It was the time when winter darkness was about to fall. And I will discuss it in more detail in a moment, but that's where this talk will begin. I also need to give you just a few key dates, how the dates came about. Originally on the 1st of May in 609 AD, it was decreed as All Martyrs' Day. And then in the 8th century, Pope Gregory III decided to include saints on this day. So it was martyrs and saints, but it became All Saints' Day. And he then designated it to the 1st of November. So 1st of November is still All Saints' Day. Throughout the 9th century, Christianity spread and started to suppress the Celtic beliefs. And by 1000 AD, the 2nd of November was then decreed as All Souls' Day to honour the dead. So at this point, Samhain was on the 31st of October, All Saints' Day was on the 1st of November, and All Souls' Day on the 2nd of November. And in many comments I've read and many beliefs is that the church attempted to replace this Celtic festival of the dead of Samhain with a related church sanctified holiday so they could legitimise it. So Samhain became All Hallows Eve, the evening before the Saints' Day. So it was All Hallows Eve was the 31st of October. That became Hallow Even, but the V was dropped. And that then turned into Halloween that we know today. So Celtic Samhain, this is the 31st of October. 2,000 years ago, the Celts were a farming and agricultural people. The Celtic year was determined by the growing seasons. So Samhain marked the end of the summer. It was a time when the harvest was gathered. It was a time when the cattle were brought down from the hills and slaughtered, ready for the winter. And the festival symbolised the boundary between the living and the dead. It was the time when the veil was lifted between those two realms. And they believed that on the 31st of October, that ghosts of the dead would revisit. So to ensure that they were safe, they lit huge bonfires in every village. And these bonfires burnt with the idea not to ward off ghosts. They were quite happy for ghosts of the ancestors and relatives to visit. It was the evil spirits. So these fires were lit to cast off any evil spirits that may also be roaming. Because if you think, they believed that this veil between the living and the dead was lifted, so anything could wander around. The hearth of the fire in each household was then lit from the embers of these giant bonfires. And the idea was that having the embers from these protective village bonfires in the home would then protect the neighbourhood, the community from evil spirits, and also keep them warm through the winter. The festival itself of Samhain had the fires. That was very symbolic. There was also a sacrifice of some of the crops, so they would burn some of their crops as a sacrifice to appease the spirits. Some animals were also sacrificed, and because the ghosts were believed to be roaming around, costumes were worn. And these costumes tended to be animal heads. I know, not very pleasant. Animal heads and animal skins. And the idea was that this would confuse any ghosts, any evil spirits that were around, and any ghost would be confused because you couldn't see who was underneath them. Also, fortunes were told. So fortune telling was and divination was quite popular. And people would leave out food and drink as offerings. So if you think of Halloween traditions today, which I will talk about for the next half hour, in this very early festival, going back nearly 2,000 years, we've got costumes, we've got food and drink as offerings, we've got fires. Sounds familiar. Oh, sorry. Yes, the Romans then conquered much of the Celtic lands when they invaded in the 1st century. And over the next 400 years-ish, they assimilated their own celebrations onto existing Celtic ones. So one example was the Roman goddess Pomona, who was the goddess of fruits and trees. I've also seen her listed as fruits and seeds. I've also seen her as just fruits. But this is a painting on the left, and you can see her symbol was the apple. So it's often believed that apple bobbing and the whole use of apples came about because of Pomona and the Roman goddess of fruit. Then the image on the right is a festival called Parentalia, which was a festival of the dead held in February time. And this was a 9-day festival which started on the 13th of February and ran through to the 21st of February. And it was a performance of ceremonies. So the purpose was to honour the ancestors and to honour the dead. And again, you can see those links coming forward. February was a month that was dedicated to purification. So this whole idea of giving the ancestors and the dead offerings and ceremonies would purify, in much the same way Samhain did on the 31st of October. I'm going to mention the Wicker Man because in his writings, Julius Caesar commented, I'm going to read this out, this is from a book I found. The Druids believed that unless for a man's life be paid, the majesty of the immortal God may not be appeased. And in public as in private life, they observe an ordinance of sacrifices of the same kind. Others use figures of immense size, whose limbs woven out of things and twigs they fill with living man and set on fire, and the men perish in a sheet of flame. Now, a man called Aylett Summers found these writings and he commissioned this engraving in 1676 from the descriptions he'd read. But its accuracy is often contested because the evidence of human sacrifice is highly ambiguous for a start. And later scholars start to write and question whether it was perhaps the Romans projecting their own practices onto their enemies. So we don't know. But whatever happened, the Wicker Man and this idea of burning spawned horror films and Halloween movies. If you haven't seen it, 1973 version is my favourite, The Wicker Man. And then a later version with Nicolas Cage, not so good, not as spooky. But yes, now a very much a Halloween tradition. Soul cakes. Now these are made for Halloween. They're they've got nuts and raisins and fruit in them. And this led to souling, which is a tradition that's a fusion of Celtic, pagan and Christian rituals. And it's been documented for a long time. And again, this will start to sound familiar. Groups of people would visit local farms and cottages, and they might sing a traditional request for apples, ale and soul cakes. This moved on to children doing it as well, but the customs also include carrying lanterns, dressing in disguise, having bonfires, divination, carrying horses' heads, which thankfully has not been a tradition that we carry forward, and performing plays. So this was called souling. Another tradition is guising or mumming, and this was particularly popular in Scotland and parts of Ireland. Very similar to souling, parents would dress up their children in very scary disguises to protect them from evil spirits. And I have to say, this image on the left, which is very early 20th century, is terrifying. It's 3 children dressed up to scare away spirits. If I was a ghost or an evil spirit, there is no way I would go near these 3 children. These children would then go door to door and people would give them offerings of food, again to ward off evil spirits. So you can see this evolution of trick-or-treating, but all of this is in the UK. And evolving from the Samhain bonfires, turnips were used. So whereas in Samhain, these huge community bonfires, instead, these small turnips were scraped out, the insides were scraped out, scary faces were carved into them, and then they were lit with a candle inside to be carried after dark on the 31st of October as protection. Sound familiar? And then obviously when it moves over to America, pumpkins are used, and we're so familiar with the pumpkin. But again, this tradition started in Scotland and Ireland. You may see them referred to as the jack-o'-lanterns, but I haven't got time to go into all that. But if you look at these and this tradition of carrying a turnip with a candle in to represent the Samhain bonfires, you can see how this tradition evolved. But yeah, I have to say, I can't look at that photograph on the left for too long. Traditional costumes, from whether it's guising or souling or these Samhain traditions became dressing up as part of Halloween, and some do follow those original traditions, and these are very representational of the original Samhain costumes. We can see here children wearing cloaks that would represent oversized cloaks and coats which would represent the animal skins, and they've got animal heads, so sort of rabbit ears and a donkey head. Thankfully they're not real. That really would be quite disgusting. And I'm going to look at some more costumes in a moment because it's quite interesting how they've evolved. But so this is where you can see, this is again is early 20th century in the UK. From 2000 years ago, the Samhain traditions have become part of our culture. The colours of Halloween, black and orange, that's what we see. You can see I'm following that tonight. I've got my little orange pumpkin and my black. The black is believed to have originated from the idea of Samhain that the end of summer, which is what Samhain is, it's the death of the summer. So black is traditionally linked to death and darkness and the dark winter that's about to fall. The orange is often quickly dismissed as being from the pumpkins, but obviously they didn't come in until much later. So it's understood that the orange could be from the autumn leaves and the colours of autumn, because again, it's that time of year that the orange would fall. I haven't found out much about the colours other than those, and that seems to be a repeated representation of why black and orange. So Halloween in America. I cannot talk about Halloween without mentioning America. I do quite a lot of work out in New Orleans and across different states. And we often hear in the UK that the Americans are to blame for Halloween. Look at what they've done. We never had it, but we did. We took it to them. So I think if anybody says to you, oh, well, you know, we wouldn't have this if it wasn't for them, at least you'll know that's not quite the case. It was really the European ethnic groups and American Indians. These traditions became meshed to create this American version of Halloween. And in the early 19th century, we'd been celebrating, remember, October the 31st and the 1st of November and the 2nd of November for centuries. It wasn't until the early 19th century that we started to see it appearing in America as a holiday and an event. And part of that is because the Puritan beliefs, if you think about colonial times, those Puritans really felt quite strongly about ghost spirits and all things Halloween and the dead. So they wouldn't allow it. However, in the late 19th century, there was the Irish potato famine, and there was a large influx of immigrants into America from Ireland who took their Halloween traditions with them. And this led to play parties, and play not in performance, it was more about playing and games, dressing up, dancing, singing, fortune telling. All of these immigrants, especially from Scotland and Ireland, took this with them. And so we took it to them. So please be aware of that, because I was also guilty of moaning about the commercialization, which to some extent is the American way, but all the traditions have come from us. I'm now going to talk a little bit about Halloween costumes. In the early 20th century, the idea was to make them as terrifying as possible. They were drawing on pagan and Christian roots, and the idea was that these costumes would mask the person's identity and ward off evil spirits. 31st of October was still deeply linked to ghosts and the supernatural and superstition. And being frightful was essential. So these, I've got some amazing photographs. I'm going to show you some of them now. But these early costumes were quite horrific. And I think it would be enough to put the fear of anybody into anybody if one of these children appeared on your doorstep, or adults, because everybody took part in this. This particular image is from 1905. It's a young child dressed up as a ghost. That's what he's supposed to be. But you can still see all of those traditions. We've got witches flying around. What's quite interesting with the witches, which is an aside, but you can see on the one in the middle that it's got a pointy nose and a pointy chin. And this wasn't really a standard representation until about the late 1930s after The Wizard of Oz. So it's quite funny that they've included that as their representation of the witch. There's a pumpkin in the middle with multiple faces carved in it, but you can see all the links to the harvest. The corn is all around this child. So it's very much an essence of Samhain and representational of that time, but quite a freaky costume. Adults joined in the fun and merriment. This is from the 1910s. And this group of ladies had their homemade witch costumes, which I think are quite delightful. Their pointy hats, all their dresses, exactly the same. But as you can see at this point, the faces aren't covered. They're just enjoying dressing up. Oh. By the 1920s, pranking had started. I'm going to talk a little bit about pranking because that was the precursor to trick or treat, and it's been around for centuries. But pranking really started in America in the 1920s, and the idea was that you hid your identity. You really did need to hide who you were. And these are three young girls from about 1922 dressed up ready for their pranking. The 1920s, all the costumes, well, I was going to say they're not all scary, but they're actually all very creepy. Of their time, so I apologise if anyone is offended by these, but they are of their time. And interestingly, the Black faces weren't representational of Black Americans. It was to do with using soot, which was a traditional way of disguise from Samhain from centuries before, and people used ashes and soot to hide their face. The idea was to disguise. It wasn't to do with race, it was to do with disguise. As you can see, we have costumes of a witch, a policeman, a clown, which is even freakier for me because I don't like clowns. So they're creepy, but they're not necessarily scary, but they are disguising. They're trying to cover their identity. This one, I think, is the most horrific of all of them. Though in the 20s, there was still that tradition of dressing up children to ward off evil spirits. As I said, the idea was to be as sinister and scary as possible. This is a very young child with her Halloween costume on. If a spirit went near this, I don't think it would. And I think it would give me nightmares for the rest of my days if a child walked up to me with this particular costume on. But it would have worked. It would have been terrifying, which was the whole point. Not quite sure what these are. They kind of look a mix between a clanger, if you're of my certain age, possibly a womble. I was a child of the 60s and 70s, so they just look like very twisted, malevolent versions of those creatures. Don't know what they're supposed to be, but this is a couple. Adults were dressing up as well as children. During the Depression, costumes had to be homemade, but you can see how imaginative and how creative parents were. This is a children's party from about 1931, 1932, and parties were used to raise the spirits for the children, to keep them entertained and keep them happy. And as you can see, there is a whole array of costumes. Not all children now are hiding their faces, but they are in their costumes. Now, underpinning the dressing up was the pranking. Not known as trick or treat, that didn't come about till much later. It just became part of the tradition to play pranks on people. And this again stems right back to Samhain. It's when villagers decided that they were going to play pranks on each other. So they're dressed up. It was quite a tradition to dress up in those animal heads and animal skins, and then play a prank on your neighbour and blame it on a spirit or a ghost. And this idea of masks and disguise was a way to get away with it. So everybody was having a great time. It was entertainment. If you think we're going back centuries, wouldn't have been a lot of entertainment. So why not dress up in animal skins, animal heads, pretend it's a ghost and prank your neighbours? And this, again, this tradition is what filtered into trick or treat. Early trick-or-treaters, which I'm going to call them now, were poor children, and they would go door to door just begging for food or money. And that was on the 31st of October. And in return, so these children would sometimes dressed up, sometimes not, because they would carry their lanterns to ward off evil. But they, in return for some money or some food, they would then pray for the departed souls of their neighbours, loved ones who had passed away. This then evolved. It started off just begging really for food and money, but then it turned into people offering to do songs and jokes and plays in return for treats. When immigrants from Scotland and Ireland arrived in the mid-1800s, instead of bringing all their traditions, the children brought the pranks, and they loved to do the pranks. Mainly little boys, especially. I've got there's a really good book called Trick or Treat, A History of Halloween by Lisa Morton, and she's written about some of the traditions, which made me smile. So obviously boys would carry carved turnips to scare people, but there were other practical jokes. They used to tie a bit of rope around a cabbage in a field, and then if anyone was walking past, they'd pull it. So obviously people believed that ghosts were wandering, and it would look like the field was haunted because this cabbage would suddenly move across a field. Or another one, which was not so pleasant, they'd get the stalk of a cabbage and just light it so it's smoking away, and hold it by a keyhole on a door, so somebody's house would stink of burning cabbage. 31st of October also became known as Gate Night. And here's a picture of two boys. This is another picture of Lisa Morton's, but it's two boys stealing a gate. this was one of the most common pranks. They'd take the gate away, so either livestock would then escape and run free, or your gate would go missing. It does make you feel that entertainment was a lot more simple then. This is another postcard of young children doing the gate pranking. On Halloween, we'll steal the gate and kilter everything that's straight. So it would just be silliness, absolute silliness. However, it started to escalate. Vandalism and violence, and there was a call to cancel Halloween. So it was believed that it was because of the Great Depression, people had time on their hands, they were disenchanted, and things started to get, it was older. This always was about children. Children were doing silly things, but then it became teenagers and adults. So there were pranks that were wagons and livestock would be lifted onto barn roofs. Vegetables would be dug up. They would, outside toilets would be tipped up onto the ground. Gates were still taken off hinges. But then there was a move, and it moved from rural areas to urban areas. But what happened then was it turned even more sinister. So glass would be broken, fires would be set. And there was this big, at the end of the 19th century, people were tripping up pedestrians and finding it very funny. So these pranks had started to get quite dangerous and become destructive. For one example, I mean, this is the kind of desperation. In Illinois in 1902, there was a call for the public to load, I'm reading this out because it was quoted in the paper, load their muskets with rock, salt or birdshot, and when trespassers invade your premises at unseemly hours upon mischief bent, pepper them good and proper. So they were given legitimate license for people to shoot at trick-or-treaters, which they weren't called then, but pranksters. And one of these pranksters, it did end in tragedy. There was a tripwire on a pavement and somebody was carrying a loaded pistol and he tripped, the gun went off and it killed one of the children. So this was just the start. It was escalating. There were horrendous stories of razor blades in apples for apple bodbin, people being pushed. There was a train crash in the late 19th, I think about 1897. Some teenage boys had created a body and put it, not real one, they'd stuffed and made like this mannequin model thing, put it across the railway tracks and caused a train crash. Thankfully, nobody was hurt in that. But again, it became worse and worse during the Great Depression. And by 1933, cities were actually going to cancel Halloween. Can you imagine? Cancel Halloween. However, Halloween was saved in late 1933. Good for me. They decided that rather than cancelling Halloween and stopping it, they could buy the young people off. They thought, right, let's not cause a rebellion from the youngsters. Let's think about this. So what they did, which is amazing, was the civic and religious authorities got together, community organisations, families, and they began to programme in parades, parties, carnivals, all for the entertainment of the children. And there wasn't much money around, but they did encourage the children to go door to door in the old tradition of dressing up and knocking doors and asking for food or money. Sometimes families hadn't got either, so they gave them bits of white sheet, which you can see on the right, so children could turn themselves into ghosts and make ghost costumes, or they would give them ashes or soot so they could disguise their faces. Again, I think these are quite sinister. They might give them treats, some people did, or they might set up their basements. There were accounts of people setting up their basements in the 1930s as haunted rooms. So again, these children were encouraged then to dress up, to take part and go house to house and knock doors and ask for this. And this was the start of trick or treat. And these are just photos from that time of children on the streets. Trick or treat itself didn't feature until 1951, and the first appearance was in a cartoon strip called Peanuts. Some of you might be familiar with Charlie Brown and Peanuts, but Charles Schulz, who was a big fan of Halloween, did 3 cartoons over Halloween in 1951, where Charlie Brown was the model for I can't remember which character, but he sat for the model of the pumpkin and was carved as the Halloween pumpkin. So in 1951, this actually really raised the popularity of Halloween. And then in 1952, Walt Disney presented Donald Duck in Trick or Treat, which was a cartoon. So in 1951-52, that's when the term trick or treat really filtered into popular culture and what we know today. Parties, which you might see referred as play parties, referring to the fact that people played games, follow the tradition and people celebrated. This is from Victorian England. This is apple bobbing, ducking for apples at Halloween. Middle class family, obviously. So that's one example. This was from the 1930s, where communities just got together and organised these parties, and they were huge events. They started prepping them in August. They were planning and preparing from August through to the 31st of October. This is what, these are university students from about 1939, maybe early 1940s, but university students embraced it. They loved Halloween and still do. This is from 1949. I have no idea what these costumes were, but it was an event for adults and children. And although this whole move from the 1930s was to encourage children to play and to have fun with it, adults still enjoyed it too. By the 1960s, children were welcomed, trick-or-treating had got a hold. Children weren't wearing scary costumes, they were wearing the costumes of their favourite characters. Not all scary anymore, not hiding their faces, but enjoying getting their sweets. And it was in the 1940s, 50s that American confectionery people really got to grip with the idea that they could make a killing out of Halloween. So candy and sweets didn't really come in until the late 1940s. So that's the trick or treat. Can't talk about Halloween without black cats and ghosts. I think the ghosts, as I've said, stem back nearly 2,000 years. Halloween is the time when that veil is dropped. So do think about that this October. It's believed that the living and the dead interact. They're out there, they're walking among us. Black cats are often associated with Halloween, and this I find quite fascinating and quite disturbing at the same time. They were associated with Halloween. Prior to the Middle Ages, they were revered. Cats were revered. If you think about Egypt, you know, they were a deity. They were really important. However, although it's not clear if black cats were bad luck omens in Europe by the 13th century, Pope Gregory IX certainly stained black cats with superstition. He decreed that in Luciferian, which was a Germanic belief, a form of devil worship, one of the devils of this satanic cult, this is his words, was said to worship, took the form of a diabolical black cat. So this was sealing the fate of the black cat. Cats were then persecuted over the next 300 years. And then in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII declared that the cat was the devil's favourite animal and idol of all witches. So that would be me done for with my cat. So cats were then always seen as quite sinister and quite evil and related to the devil. In the 1500s, beliefs were so strong in America in particular that Puritans began the practice of burning black cats on Shrove Tuesday, ready for Lent, because they believed it would protect their homes from fires. For us, obviously, the witch is familiar. A black cat is seen as being, you know, the witch has turned herself into a black cat. And so these poor creatures have had a bad deal from about 1200. Black cats still appear in horror films. They're the one that screeches and leaps out and makes you jump usually, and they're still around. But for many, black cats are a sign of good luck, and I was always brought up that if a black cat crossed my path, that was a good luck, not a bad luck thing. And I adore them. And if you're not a cat lover, I'm sorry, but you know, they've had a rough deal for nearly 1,000 years, so I think it's time to give them a break. Okay, I'm drawing this to a close now, but I do want to tell you about some superstition and spells that revolve around Halloween. It's believed that it's a very potent time for magic. Again, magic is very powerful around the 31st of October. So usually associated with romance. Most of the spells are to do with romance and marrying and futures. So I've put some hazelnuts on the left. Now, this is one that goes one of two ways. It's believed that if you put up a little row of hazelnuts, name each one, put a name on each one of a potential suitor or future husband, then throw them in the fire, the one that doesn't explode or burn to ashes will be the name of your future husband. But I've also read in other accounts that it's the one that does burn is your name of future husband. So I don't know what you do with that one. On the right, we've got apple peelings. It's believed if you throw those over your shoulder, it would form the initials of your future spouse. Other ones are, in Ireland, there was a tradition of inviting potential partners to dinner. Put your ring in the mashed potato and whoever finds it is your man. Stare at an egg yolk in water and you might see the reflection of your future husband, or stare into a mirror with candlelight. It's also a time to be super cautious if you're superstitious. Don't walk under ladders, don't step on cracks in the pavement, don't break a mirror, and don't spill salt. So these are all things that are associated with Halloween. And of course, apple bobbing. And this was also used to predict the future. The first successful apple bobber in your little group would be the first to marry. So to summarize, it's not satanic. It's nothing to do with devil worship. It originates from Celtic traditions, Roman festivals and Christian beliefs that have all merged together. Immigration took it to America. We can't blame the Americans entirely for this. We can blame them for the commodification of it and for the pumpkins, but that's it. We took it over there. It's a family celebration. The costumes today are favourite characters rather than scary. Pumpkins instead of turnips. And it's now the second largest holiday in the USA after Christmas, which is fascinating. And so to end, I just wish you all a jolly Halloween. Thank you for listening.